Maureen O'Hara was more than just a stunning actress with sharp tongue and flaming red hair. To most, she was Hollywood royalty, the fierce Irish beauty who starred alongside John Wayne in some of the most iconic films of the Golden Age. But what audiences didn't see was the private storm that brewed behind the camera. For decades, O'Hara kept quiet about the darker truths of her career. And when she finally decided to speak out, the revelations were nothing short of explosive. At the heart of her story was one man, a co-star so dominant, so beloved, and so controversial that her admission left fans speechless. From the outside, their relationship looked electric. Moviegoers fell in love with the chemistry between Maureen O'Hara and John Wayne, especially in classics like The Quiet Man. They laughed, fought, and embraced on-screen like they were made for each other. But the tension in those scenes wasn't all acting. In a later interview, O'Hara dropped the bomb. He was the actor I hated most. She wasn't exaggerating. Their real-life dynamic was anything but friendly. It was a clash of giants, two unstoppable forces trying to dominate the screen and each other. O'Hara was never one to bow down. In an industry where women were expected to be soft-spoken and obedient, she was neither. And Wayne, he didn't like being challenged. Their rivalry brewed over decades, fueled by pride, politics, and personal grudges. But for years, she kept the details buried under that famous Hollywood gloss. The world didn't know the full story until she started revealing it piece by piece. And it wasn't just about John Wayne. O'Hara's life in Hollywood was a battlefield. She confronted harassment, exposed lies, and fought the system that tried to crush her spirit. This wasn't a typical starlet's tale of fame and fortune. This was a war of survival, one that started long before she ever stepped onto a film set with Wayne, and continued well after the final credits rolled. What makes Maureen's story so compelling is how long she kept it to herself. For decades, she played a role they wanted, the tough but lovable screen siren. But in her final years, she chose truth over legacy. She let the world see behind the curtain. She wasn't just there to entertain. She had something to expose. And the man who made her life a living nightmare, she didn't just name him. She told the world exactly how she handled him. But that's just where the story begins. Long before most actresses dared to speak up, Maureen O'Hara was already fighting battles behind the glittering curtain of Hollywood. The year was 1945, and O'Hara had just been branded something shocking, a cold potato. Why? Because she said no. In a time when studio bosses, producers, and directors could make or break a woman's entire career with a single word, saying no to inappropriate advances was unthinkable. But O'Hara didn't just say no. She said it loudly. She rejected the hidden rules of Hollywood's casting couch culture, and it cost her dearly. At just 25 years old, O'Hara gave an interview that rocked the industry. She called out the sexual exploitation taking place behind closed doors, something nobody talked about, especially not publicly. She described being harassed by powerful men who assumed she'd play the game to keep her career alive. When she refused, the retaliation was swift and quiet. Offers dried up. The press whispered she was difficult. But worse than that, she was called frigid, uncooperative, cold. Not for how she acted, but for what she refused to do. It was an industry-wide smear campaign designed to keep her in line. But Maureen didn't budge. She told reporters, "I was a tough Irish girl who refused to compromise her principles." And she meant it. She never let anyone exploit her, and if it meant fewer roles or harder paths, so be it. She wasn't going to trade her dignity for screen time. Behind her strong public persona, the toll was real. She once confessed that she hated going to work, not because of the acting, but because of what she had to endure just to be on set. The stares, the advances, the whispers behind her back. Every day on set could be a test of her endurance and integrity. And while many in Hollywood stayed silent or accepted the status quo, O'Hara became one of the earliest examples of what it meant to resist. That early stand against harassment didn't make her popular with the men in charge, but but it made her respected, even feared. Studios couldn't figure her out. She was beautiful, talented, bankable, but totally uninterested in playing a submissive role they expected from female stars. And unlike others who eventually conformed or quietly exited, she stayed and made them work around her. In her later years, when the #MeToo movement began shedding light on what many actresses had endured in silence, Maureen O'Hara's story resurfaced. People looked back at her interviews, her quotes, and her refusal to play the game, and realized she had been a voice decades ahead of her time. She didn't just speak out, she lived her resistance. And while she paid the price, her legacy stood tall. But this wasn't the only battle she had to fight. The next would get even more personal and violent. If Hollywood was a jungle, Maureen O'Hara wasn't just surviving. She was fighting tooth and nail to carve out her own territory. And she wasn't afraid of anyone. Not even the men behind the camera, the ones who control careers with a flick of a pen or a phone call. Two of them would try to push her, control her, intimidate her, and both would come to regret it. The first was director John Farrow, a man known in the industry for his charm, ego, and a nasty habit of abusing power. While working with O'Hara, he crossed a line that went far beyond the bounds of professionalism. According to account from O'Hara herself, Farrow began making aggressive advances toward her offset, unwanted, uninvited, and relentless. He reportedly even showed up at her home unannounced, believing that his status would somehow win her over. But Farrow misjudged her. Badly. O'Hara didn't scream. She didn't run. She didn't write a letter to the studio. She punched him right in the jaw. That's not a metaphor. She physically struck him and made it crystal clear that she wasn't going to be one of those girls who put up with bad behavior to keep the peace. She never apologized. She didn't need to. That punch became legendary in private studio circles. And so did her reputation for being untouchable in all the right ways. But the battles didn't stop there. Next came John Ford, one of the most celebrated directors of all time. A genius behind the camera and a tyrant in front of it. Ford directed O'Hara in several films and was known for ruling his sets with fear, sarcasm, and manipulation. He adored John Wayne and had a complicated, often toxic dynamic with the actors he worked with, especially strong women who didn't fit the mold. O'Hara clashed with him repeatedly. He'd belittle her in front of the crew, bark out commands, and try to break her spirit. But she gave it right back to him. In one now famous moment, after Ford snapped at her for what he called talking back, she fired off. "Don't you dare yell at me like I'm one of your little boys. I'm not afraid of you, Ford." That kind of defiance didn't win her any favors, but it did earn respect. What made these moments stand out wasn't just the confrontations. It was the era. Most actresses would have taken the abuse in silence, smiled through it, and gone home in tears. But Maureen O'Hara wasn't built that way. She didn't just protect herself. She sent a warning to every man who thought they could cross the line. Don't. And still, somehow, she kept working, still starring in major pictures, still holding her ground. Because even as powerful directors tried to control her, they couldn't deny one thing. Maureen O'Hara was a force. But the real storm was brewing just offset, and it involved a man the world adored, but she learned to loathe. To the world, Maureen O'Hara and John Wayne were the ultimate screen couple, fiery, passionate, unforgettable. Their chemistry in films like The Quiet Man and McLintock felt so real, audiences swore they had to be in love. But the truth was far more complicated. Off-screen, their relationship was marked by power struggles, bruised egos, and a battle of wills that few people ever saw. It wasn't that they hated each other, at least not at first. They respected one another's talent. They admired each other's strength. But both were dominant forces who refused to be overshadowed. And when two icons that big share the same spotlight, something's bound to explode. From the start, O'Hara saw through Wayne's larger-than-life persona. He was America's tough guy, the cowboy, the soldier, the hero. But Maureen wasn't impressed by the image. She called him out challenged his authority, and stood toe-to-toe with him on set. While most actresses deferred to Wayne, O'Hara pushed back. She knew that if she didn't, he'd steamroll her. And Wayne didn't like being challenged, especially by a woman. Their clashes weren't just private. On set, the tension could be felt by the entire crew. During the filming of McLintock, a scene where Wayne famously spanks O'Hara with a cold shovel took on a dark tone. O'Hara later admitted the slap was real, painfully real. Wayne had insisted on doing the scene himself and with full force, despite her objections. It wasn't just about acting anymore, it was about control. And that moment, for her, crossed a line. O'Hara never forgot it. She said in later years that Wayne enjoyed playing the macho man a little too much. Behind his charm was a stubborn, controlling side that rubbed her raw. And while she never painted him as a villain, she didn't sugarcoat their history either. In her own words, "We were like oil and water. We mixed easily, but we made a hell of a fire." What frustrated her most wasn't just the physicality or dominance. It was how Wayne's popularity allowed him to get away with anything. He was protected, idolized, and rarely challenged. And when she did confront him, it often turned into a shouting match. Their arguments could last for hours, sometimes days. But still, they kept working together. Because for all the tension, the result on screen was magic. That on-screen fire came from a very real place. The passion, the rage, the raw intensity. It wasn't acting. It was the two of them trying to outmatch each other in every scene. And while the audience saw sparks, what they didn't know was how much it came from real, unresolved conflict. In the end, Maureen O'Hara admitted that working with Wayne was both the best and worst experience of her career. She respected his talent, but resented the way he tried to dominate her. And though she played along for the sake of the film, behind the scenes, she never let him forget who he was dealing with. But the feud didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. In fact, some of their most shocking moments happened when no one was watching. The fiery tension between Maureen O'Hara and John Wayne didn't stop at the studio gates. What the public saw were two legends lighting up the screen with charm and fire. What they didn't see were the brutal arguments, the wounded pride, and the unfiltered hostility that sometimes erupted when no one else was supposed to be watching. O'Hara rarely opened up about these moments during her prime. The Hollywood machine preferred its stars silent, polished, and agreeable. But in her later years, as her legacy was cemented and her voice could no longer be silenced, she began to speak. And what she revealed was enough to shock even longtime fans. One of the most infamous incidents happened during a break in filming on the set of The Quiet Man. The crew had paused for lunch, and most of the cast had wandered off set. O'Hara remained behind, running lines. Wayne entered the scene unexpectedly. What followed wasn't a playful rehearsal. It was a blowout. A disagreement over script changes turned into a screaming match. Witnesses later said Wayne called her impossible, while O'Hara accused him of bulldozing everyone just to get his way. Neither of them backed down, and that wasn't unusual. Wayne had a towering ego, and O'Hara, well, she refused to shrink herself to fit his world. She once recounted how Wayne stormed off set after she made an offhand comment about his acting being a little wooden in a scene. He didn't talk to her for 2 full days, even though they were shooting together daily. When he finally broke the silence, he told her, "You've got a big mouth, Irish." She shot back, "And you've got a thin skin for such a big man." This wasn't a spat between friends. This was a battle of dominance, and both were used to winning. Their political views also drove a wedge between them. Wayne was famously conservative, unapologetically so. O'Hara, though private, leaned in a very different direction and refused to be told what to think. When Wayne would rant about politics on set, O'Hara would openly mock him, once telling a crew member that listening to him was like being trapped in a bar with a drunk uncle who thinks he's running the country. Despite the hostility, neither could walk away. They were a box office goldmine. Audiences believed in their chemistry. Studios begged them to keep working together. And so they did. But every collaboration was a powder keg waiting to blow. To her credit, O'Hara never painted herself as a victim. She stood by her choices, even the hard ones. But she also made it clear that working with Wayne came at a personal cost. Behind the smiles, the hugs, the warm press photos, there were two titans locked in an unspoken war, one that never really ended. Still, there was one moment, one final, shocking exchange that changed everything between them. And when it happened, neither one would ever forget it. As the years wore on, the fire between Maureen O'Hara and John Wayne never truly faded. It simply simmered beneath the surface. They had made some of the most unforgettable films of their time, but behind those moments was a relationship built not on friendship or affection, but mutual respect and unresolved tension. The final confrontation came years after their last film together. By then, the industry had changed. So had they. The golden era of Hollywood was fading, and both O'Hara and Wayne were facing their own personal battles, aging, health issues, and the quiet loneliness that often follow fame. It was 1979 when the two met again in an award ceremony, long after their last collaboration. John Wayne, visibly weaker from the illness that would eventually take his life, spotted O'Hara from across the room. To everyone's surprise, he made a beeline for her. What happened next wasn't angry or bitter. It was raw. Wayne, for one of the first times in his life, let the mask slip. He admitted that she had always been the only woman who ever truly stood up to him, on screen or off. "You were the only one who didn't take my SHD, he said with a faint smile. O'Hara didn't flinch. She looked him in the eye and replied, "Because you were full of it, Duke, and someone had to tell you." There was a long silence between them. For a moment, it felt like decades of friction had melted away into something that almost resembled peace. But then Wayne, ever the sentimentalist behind his gruff image, said something that would stay with her forever. "I gave you hell, but damn, you made me better." O'Hara later admitted that moment caught her off guard. She hadn't expected remorse, and she certainly hadn't expected praise. But she took it for what it was, a final olive branch from a man who had never known how to say sorry. He died just weeks later. In the years after his passing, O'Hara was repeatedly asked about John Wayne. People wanted the fairy tale version, the warm friendship, the private affection, the deep connection. But O'Hara never gave them that. What she gave them was truth. She told one interviewer, "We weren't sweet. We weren't romantic. We were fire and fight and grit. But we were real." She didn't pretend he was a saint. In fact, she called him one of the most difficult men I've ever known. But she also acknowledged something rare, that without him, her own legend might not have burned as brightly. Their chemistry was born of conflict, not love. And somehow, that made it all the more powerful. Her last words about him, years after his death, were surprisingly tender. "He drove me crazy. But we made history, didn't we?" And yes, they did. But the cost of that history, the emotional toll, the pressure, the private scars, never fully left her. Because long before modern Hollywood ever addressed toxic behavior, Maureen O'Hara had lived through it and fought back. By the time the spotlight began to fade, Maureen O'Hara had already carved her name into Hollywood history, but not without scars. She had stood her ground in a system designed to break women who didn't obey. She wasn't just an actress. She was a fighter, a woman who refused to play the game the way it was written. And in doing so, she paid a price few could see from the outside. O'Hara's legacy wasn't built on scandal or publicity stunts. It was built on defiance. When studio executives tried to mold her, she pushed back. When directors tried to dominate her, she fought. And when co-stars, especially powerful men like John Wayne, tried to control the narrative, she rewrote it in her own voice. But that strength came with a sense of isolation that lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. In the golden age of Hollywood, women who were difficult were blacklisted quietly, punished in roles, or erased from future opportunities. O'Hara didn't cave, but she didn't escape untouched either. As the roles dried up and younger, more compliant actresses filled the screens, O'Hara stepped away, not in disgrace, but in quiet rebellion. She didn't fade. She simply refused to be anything less than who she was. Her later years were quieter. She moved away from the limelight, settling in the U.S. and spending much of her time in Ireland. But even then, she carried the weight of the industry's silence around her. Many of her stories, especially the darker ones, remain untold for decades, partly because the world wasn't ready to hear them. Hollywood preferred its legends neat, polished, and obedient. O'Hara was none of those things. It wasn't until the 2000s that her true legacy began to reemerge. As younger generations look back at the icons of old Hollywood, they found in Maureen something rare, a woman who spoke out before it was safe, who stood tall when others were forced to shrink. In interviews late in life, she spoke with the same sharp clarity that had both enchanted and enraged men like Wayne and Ford. There was no bitterness, just truth. In 2014, the Academy gave her an honorary Oscar for Lifetime Achievement. It was long overdue, and when she took the stage, there was no dramatic speech, no teary breakdown, just quiet power. A woman who had earned every ounce of that recognition, not by playing the game, but by surviving it on her terms. She had one message that night: I was fortunate to work with the best, and to never let them change me. That line, simple, direct, spoke volumes. In a system that demanded women stay silent, smile wide, and never step out of line, Maureen O'Hara had walked through the fire and never bowed. But perhaps the most telling sign of her impact was what she didn't say. She never asked for sympathy. She never apologized for being strong. And even in death, she left behind a blueprint for every woman coming after her. Don't bend. Don't break. And don't ever stay quiet just to be liked. Maureen O'Hara's story isn't just a tale from Hollywood's golden age. It's a lesson in power, resilience, and the price of speaking up. Behind the glamour, the lights, and the unforgettable films was a woman who refused to be controlled. She didn't follow the script. She rewrote it, while others were celebrated for their silence. O'Hara earned her legacy by pushing back. She stood up to legends. She called out injustice. And in doing so, she exposed a truth that's still uncomfortable today. That strength in a woman is often seen as a threat, until history finally catches up and calls it courage. She wasn't perfect. She wasn't always kind. But she was real. And that's what made her unforgettable. If you found this story as revealing as we did, and you want more untold Hollywood truths, legendary feuds, and stories that challenge what you thought you knew, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones they tried to bury.